A soldier came home after 20 years, only to be turned away by a daughter who had no idea who he was. The bus hissed to a stop, its brakes sighing like a tired beast finally allowed to rest. For Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, the sound was alien. For 2 decades, the dominant sounds had been the whine of engines, the distant crack of conflict, and the oppressive, ringing silence of a sun-baked desert. The air that drifted through the open door smelled of damp asphalt and pine, a perfume so potent with memory it almost brought him to his knees. He moved down the steps, his left leg dragging with a practiced, unnatural rhythm. The prosthetic was a good one, the best the military could provide, but it would never feel like his own. It was a permanent reminder of the ambush, of the long years that followed in darkness and confusion, of a life he was told was over. He slung the heavy duffel bag over his good shoulder. It was the only thing he owned in the world that connected the man who left to the man who returned. Inside were a few spare clothes, a thick file of back pay documentation, and a worn, folded photograph of a smiling woman and a toddler with bright, curious eyes. His ghosts. His reasons. He didn't take a taxi from the station. He wanted to walk the last half mile. He needed to feel the solid, unbroken pavement of home under his feet. He needed to retrace his steps, to overwrite the 20 years of phantom landscapes that haunted his sleep. The walk was a pilgrimage. The neighborhood was an archive of ghosts. The old oak tree on the corner of Elm and Main still stood, its branches reaching like gnarled arms. He remembered pushing his wife, Laura, on a swing he'd hung from its thickest limb, her laughter echoing in the summer air. Mrs. Gable's house still had its immaculate rose bushes, pruned and perfect. He could almost smell them. Each familiar detail was a knot in his throat. He had held onto these images like a rosary in the dark, reciting them to himself to stay sane. The crack in the sidewalk in front of the Miller house. The slightly crooked fence post at number 42. They were all still there. Unchanged. Waiting. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. He wouldn't call first. It had to be a surprise. He'd just appear at the door, a miracle walking out of a forgotten war. Laura would cry. She would touch the scars on his face, tracing the map of his lost years. And Maya, his little girl, would be a woman now. 22. Would she remember him? A vague sense of a father who smelled of sawdust and old spice? He hoped so. He prayed so. He turned the final corner, and his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner beating against bone. He saw the house. And the world stopped. It was the right house, the one with the big bay window where they used to put the Christmas tree. But it was wrong. All wrong. The paint was a soft, welcoming blue, not the stark white he remembered. The trim was a cheerful yellow. A neat flower bed, filled with vibrant tulips, ran along the foundation where Laura's unruly vegetable patch used to be. His soldier's mind catalogued the discrepancies with cold, brutal efficiency. Threat assessment. Anomaly detection. The worst of it was the mailbox. A small, black box on a new post. The name, painted in elegant white script, was not Cole, it was Henderson. The air left his lungs in a rush. The duffel bag, once a symbol of his journey home, suddenly felt like an anchor, pulling him down into the cold, unforgiving earth. He stood rooted to the spot on the opposite sidewalk, a statue of a forgotten man. His carefully constructed dream, the one that had been his shield and his sustenance for 20 years, began to fracture. He didn't move. He just watched. The house was quiet. No light shone from the windows, though the afternoon was growing dim. His instincts, honed in places where stillness meant danger, screamed at him. But this wasn't a dusty village street. This was home. Or it was supposed to be. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He felt the curious stares of a neighbor walking their dog, the brief glance of a driver passing by. He was an oddity. A scarred man with a military-grade leg and a haunted look, staring at a stranger's house. Then, the front door opened. A young woman stepped out onto the porch to grab a package that had been left there. She had long brown hair, the same shade as Laura's. She moved with a familiar grace. And when she turned her head, catching a bit of the fading light, he saw it. He saw his wife's eyes. He saw his own stubborn jawline. It was Maya. All the air, all the sound, all the logic in the world vanished. There was only her. The photograph in his bag had come to life, aged 20 years in the blink of an eye. A sound tore from his throat, a rough, desperate croak. Maya? Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. She saw him then, a stranger across the street. A broken man half hidden in the twilight. Her face, open and soft a moment before, hardened with fear and confusion. She clutched the package to her chest like a shield. He took a clumsy step forward, his prosthetic leg dragging on the asphalt. Maya, it's me. Her expression didn't change. There was no flicker of recognition. Only the deep, instinctual distrust of a young woman confronted by an unknown man who knew her name. I think you have the wrong house, she said, her voice firm but trembling slightly. You should leave. No, wait, he pleaded, his voice cracking. I'm your father. The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. He saw the shift in her eyes, from fear to a kind of cautious pity. She thought he was delusional. Unwell. My father is inside, she said, her voice softer now, as if speaking to a lost child. Please. You need to go. Before he could say another word, she backed away, fumbled with the doorknob, and slipped inside. The lock clicked shut with a finality that echoed louder than any gunshot he had ever heard. The blue door was a wall. A final, insurmountable barrier. He stood there, his entire world compressed into that single, devastating moment. The blood ran cold in his veins. The ground seemed to tilt beneath his feet. He was MIA all over again, not in a foreign land, but on the street where he grew up. He was a ghost at his own front door. The duffel bag slid from his shoulder and hit the pavement with a heavy thud, the weight of 20 years of hope finally becoming too much to bear. He didn't know how long he stood there after the door closed. Time had lost its meaning. Eventually, the cold seeped into his bones, a deep, gnawing chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He picked up his bag and turned away from the blue house. There was only one other place to go, a place of last resort. A place of sanctuary. The stained glass windows of St. Jude's Church glowed like embers in the encroaching darkness. He pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, wax, and incense. It was the smell of confession and comfort. An old man in a cassock was sweeping the aisle. He looked up, his eyes kind and questioning. It was Father Michael. He was older, his hair completely white, but his face was the same. Can I help you, son? The priest asked. Marcus could barely speak. His identity, his very existence, felt like a lie. Father, do you remember me? Marcus Cole. Father Michael's broom clattered to the floor. He stared, his mouth agape. He stepped closer, peering at Marcus's face, at the scars that webbed across his cheek and forehead. The priest's eyes filled with a look of profound, terrified disbelief. Marcus? My God! It can't be. It is, Marcus whispered. But you were. Father Michael crossed himself, a gesture of instinct and shock. We held a funeral for you. There's a plaque in the town square. Your name is on it. They sat in the front pew, the vast, empty church a silent witness to a resurrection no one had prayed for. Marcus listened as Father Michael filled in the 20 years of blank space, the story of the life that had grown over his grave. The notification came 6 months after your unit went missing, the priest explained, his voice gentle. Missing, presumed killed in action. It shattered Laura. Absolutely shattered her. For years, she was just a shadow. She kept the house exactly as you'd left it, waiting for a miracle. Marcus closed his eyes, the physical pain in his leg a dull echo of the agony in his chest. But a miracle never came, Father Michael continued. And she had Maya to think about. A little girl needs a life. She needs a mother who isn't a ghost. It took a long, long time. But eventually, she met Mark Henderson. A good man. A kind, steady man who worked as an accountant downtown. He knew all about you. He honored your memory. He loved Laura, and he fell in love with the little girl she was raising. The name on the mailbox. Henderson. It wasn't just a name. It was a life. A whole life. They got married about 10 years after you were gone, Father Michael said. Mark adopted Maya. He raised her as his own. To her, he's the only father she has ever known. You are a story, Marcus. A black and white photograph of a hero on the mantelpiece. Not a man of flesh and blood. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. He was a myth. A legend passed down. He wasn't real. And Laura, he asked, the name feeling like ground glass in his mouth. The priest's face fell, etched with a deep and genuine sorrow. I'm so sorry, son. Laura passed away 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. It was fast. Mark was with her through all of it. He was a rock for her, and for Maya. The final support beam of his fantasy collapsed. Laura was gone. The reunion he had played out in his mind, the anchor of his sanity, was an impossibility. He had come home to a life that had already mourned him, buried him, and moved on. His return wasn't a miracle. It was a complication. A horror. He saw it with devastating clarity. He wasn't a husband returning to his wife or a father returning to his daughter. He was a ghost who had forgotten he was dead. To storm back into that blue house would be an act of profound violence. He would be destroying the memory of the sainted hero and replacing it with himself, a scarred, broken man with a limp and 20 years of trauma in his eyes. He would be taking a wrecking ball to the foundations of his daughter's entire existence, forcing her to question the love of the only father she ever truly knew. His duty, he realized, hadn't changed. In the desert, his duty was to protect his men. Here, now, his duty was to protect his daughter. And the greatest threat to her peace, to her happiness, was him. He checked into a small, anonymous motel on the edge of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions. The room was sterile, smelling of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. It was a perfect purgatory. He sat on the edge of the stiff bed and finally opened his duffel bag. He pulled out the photograph. Laura, young and vibrant, her arm around a tiny Maya who was holding a dandelion. He stared at the image until it blurred through his tears. He wasn't just grieving for Laura, or for the life he'd lost. He was grieving for the man in the photograph. That man was gone forever, and nothing could bring him back. His choice was clear. It was the hardest tactical decision he had ever had to make. He could charge forward, reclaim his name, and leave a trail of emotional devastation in his wake. Or he could perform one last act of service. He could fall on his sword. Metaphorically, this time. He spent the next day making arrangements. He went to a lawyer and used the substantial back pay from the government, 20 years of a staff sergeant's salary, to create a trust fund. It was anonymous, set to pay for Maya's education, a down payment on a house, anything she might ever need. A ghost's inheritance. Then, he went back to the church. He wrote a letter, his hand shaking as he formed the words. It wasn't a letter from a father. It was a letter from a soldier. He explained that he had survived, but that the man who was Laura's husband and Maya's first father had not truly made it home from the war. He told her he had seen her, and that he saw she was happy and loved. He wrote about her mother's courage, and about the goodness of the man who raised her. He told her that his final mission was to ensure her peace was not disturbed. He signed it simply, "A friend of your mother's." He gave the sealed envelope to Father Michael. "Give this to her," he said. "Maybe on her wedding day. Or maybe never. You'll know if the time is right." The priest took the letter, his eyes shining with tears. "This is the most profound act of love I have ever witnessed, Marcus." "It's my duty," Marcus replied, the words tasting like ash. He turned and walked out of the church, leaving his old life behind for the second, and final, time. Months passed. The seasons turned. Winter's chill gave way to the tentative warmth of spring. Marcus didn't leave town. He rented a small apartment above the old hardware store on Main Street. He got a job there, stocking shelves, mixing paint, cutting keys. The work was simple, tangible. The weight of a hammer in his hand was real. He became a quiet fixture in the town. A man with a limp and a scarred face who kept to himself. No one knew who he was, or where he came from. He was just Marcus. From his new post, he had a clear line of sight to the town square. He had a new mission. He was a sentinel. He saw Maya sometimes. He saw her laughing with friends, saw her studying in the library, saw her walking hand in hand with a young man who looked at her with adoration. He learned the rhythm of her life from a distance. He never approached her. He never spoke to her. He was a ghost, after all, and ghosts were meant to watch, not to interfere. His presence was a secret he would carry forever. One bright Saturday afternoon, he was looking out his window, cleaning the dust from the sill. He saw her down below, sitting on a bench with Mark Henderson, the man who had been her father. Mark handed her an ice cream cone, and she threw her head back and laughed, a sound so full of joy it carried all the way up to his second-story window. A sharp, familiar pain lanced through Marcus's heart. The pain of the life he could never have. But beneath it, something else was stirring. A quiet, profound sense of peace. He had returned from the war, but he had not come home to the house with the bay window. Home was no longer a place. It was a purpose. His war was over, but his watch had just begun. And from his lonely outpost above Main Street, the soldier, at last, felt a sense of peace. He was protecting his daughter. He was home.